With EJ Antoni. He's an economist at the Heritage Foundation and the in-house economist for the Vince Coglianese Show. EJ, good to have you with us.
Vince, thanks for having me back. No thanks for making me listen to another one of these lousy clips, but thanks for having me back.
Can explore, if you will, the economic principle underneath what she just said, which is that this makes an economy more fair for everyone if they take money from you.
Well, in a word, I would say the underlying economic principle is theft. This is not a matter of giving someone what they are due, which is the definition of justice. This is a matter of giving someone what will get them to vote for me, which, again, in this case is just theft and nothing more. I mean, you are not owed anything by your fellow man. They do not owe you repayment of your student loans, but that's exactly what this administration is saying justice is in their very warped definition. Somehow an economy that works for everyone punishes those who never went to college, punishes those who paid off their student debt, punishes those who went to college but worked and saved so they didn't have to go into debt in the first place. In other words, all of the people who were responsible get punished.
Yeah, and I feel like an idiot for having paid off my federal student loans a while ago. Still working on those private loans. It's been many years. No relief for me. So who is receiving relief here? As you look at, who's the beneficiary of all of this theft? What's the typical person look like?
Well, ironically, it's not what a lot of people would imagine, which is somebody, let's say, who's working minimum wage. Maybe they have 20, 30, or even 60 or 70,000 dollars in student loan debt. No, it's actually typically people who have professional degrees. So we're talking about not just someone who's got a bachelor's and a master's, but typically they have an even more advanced degree after the master's, and they are oftentimes making six figures, and they are the ones who hold the bulk of this student loan debt. And as a consequence of that, they are getting the most relief. In other words, the people who need it the least are the ones who are going to get the most. That's, as the president would say, that's Bidenomics.
Right, and it's also the opposite of what the left refers to as progressive. That would be regressive, wouldn't it?
Oh, it's highly regressive. But, Vince, so much of what the left says doesn't match what they do. So much of what they do to the tax code, for example, in order to make that more progressive, does exactly the opposite. It makes it regressive. Look at what they want to do with the SALT deduction, for example.
Yeah, let's get into the details here. So I think a lot of people hear that the Trump tax cuts, that's the phrase everyone uses because it's mostly correct. I mean, these are tax cuts, but that the Trump tax cuts will be going away next year unless Washington intervenes. Joe Biden's position is, should he be reelected, he's going to allow those tax cuts to expire, and taxes are going to go up on almost everybody. But as you point out in your research, there's a category of person who's going to get a substantial tax cut when the Trump tax reform expires, and Biden's not telling you about it. Who's getting a tax cut if that happens?
Well, Vince, you're spot on. So the vast majority of Americans will pay higher taxes if Trump's tax reform expires. There's a very small sliver of the population, however, where it will be the opposite. They're going to get a windfall in the millions of dollars. Who is this very small elite group? Well, they are the elite. They're very wealthy people, high income earners, but only in high tax locations. In other words, blue states, places like New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California, because the state and local tax deduction that was capped at just $10,000 under President Trump, that would be unlimited, which is what it was before his tax reform. And so instead of only deducting $10,000 from your federal tax bill, you could deduct millions of dollars. That's not an exaggeration. And as a consequence of that, a very high income earner in a place like New York City would actually save 9% of their federal tax liability. Again, that's a windfall measured in the millions of dollars, most of which is simply just going to get funneled right back into the Democrat campaign coffers via donations.
So that means, what that means, as I understand it, is that a truck driver who lives in a red state will end up subsidizing the government expenditures of, say, Warren Buffett's state, New York.
It's exactly right. What the SALT deduction effectively does is cause taxpayers in low tax states, aka red states typically, to pay for wealthy people in blue states, aka the high tax states.
Oh, Warren Buffett lives in Nebraska. I should say that, but I do think of Wall Street when I think of Warren Buffett. But you have rich people living in New York who are going to get subsidies from middle class people who just got their taxes hiked.
Exactly. That's precisely right, Vince.
Yeah, it's the story they don't tell you when they talk about this. Oh, we're gonna raise taxes on rich people. Well, yeah, just rich people who live in responsible states, like red states. All right, let me. I want to move on to another thing that occurred this week that I think is worthy of note, which is that you testified before Congress this week. In fact, you testified before the United States Senate. What was the hearing about?
The hearing was about how evil corporations are gouging consumers, especially regarding food prices, and how the only reason that you're actually paying more at the grocery store is just because all these companies are colluding with each other in order to gouge you and raise prices. So corporate greed is responsible for inflation. Never mind the fact that, we printed trillions of dollars that we didn't have in order to finance all of this government spending that we couldn't afford. That had nothing to do with it, Vince.
All right, so the Democrats organized a buck-passing exercise. They said it's not Biden's fault, it's not our fault, it's these evil corporations. Take a listen. This is an exchange between Senator Elizabeth Warren of, I'm not sure what tribe she's a part of, I forget, and Dr. EJ Antoni. Here we go.
So I just got a couple of questions. I want to follow up on where we started out. Dr. Antoni, if I understand you,
she thinks it's Anthony. She didn't do her research.
I think you're saying that the reason we're seeing high grocery prices is all Joe Biden's fault because he led Congress in the direction, or at least led the Democrats in the direction of doing things like investing in infrastructure and child care and helping us get over the pandemic. Is that kind of a rough statement? You say the model tells you more money must be the reason that grocery prices are up. Is that right?
Partly, Senator, absolutely. Although I wouldn't put all the blame.
Everybody concedes that we got a lot of different points going on. Mm-hmm. But I think I heard you say that that's the reason grocery prices are up so high. Am I wrong? Did I misunderstand you?
It's not just the spending that the president insisted upon. It's the spending that this Congress
I'm willing to put Congress in there. So it's what we have done.
I love this. As soon as she started asking the question, I knew, I was like, he's not going to let her slide. You're also to blame, aren't you, Elizabeth Warren? I'm glad you caught her on that.
Oh, exactly. And, she, of course, talks about how, this spending was for the children, right? It's for things like child care and building roads and bridges. So I went back and looked, Vince, less than 1% of the spending under Biden has gone to roads and bridges. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. And that's even after the fact that they passed a so-called infrastructure bill that was over $1 trillion. There's literally more money in that bill to destroy existing roadways than build new ones.
What's funny about Elizabeth Warren in particular is, and this is clearly a sign that she's just a creature of left-wing power, obviously, but earlier in her career, she had written this book. I think it was called The Two-Income Trap, and the idea was that if you have multiple income earners in a single household, as so many households do now, it leads to this kind of like a race for goods. Like, goods are more expensive now. There's an inflationary impact to having two incomes in every household, and as a result, it's harder to have a single-income household in America now. So she understood the basic economic principles at some point earlier in her career. Now that's all gone out the window. Now she's like, what? I don't even understand what you're saying, EJ Antoni.
No, Vince, you're absolutely right. She actually makes several good points in that book, but unfortunately, as you said, she has completely abandoned any economic principles or any economic understanding whatsoever. She knows about as much on economics, and I would say AOC. That might be generous, but anyway, the point is that at the end of the day, that's a really, really important thing to understand, that if you're going to strongly encourage every woman to go to work instead of staying home and raising her children, then you are going to drastically increase the labor supply by roughly doubling it. And that is going to have the effect of pushing down wage growth. There's no doubt about that. I mean,
Yeah.
you can argue for other reasons that women should be in the workforce, and that's fine. You can have that, you can make that case, but it's indisputable that a doubling of the labor supply is going to put downward pressure on wage growth.
Right, right. So I'll play a little bit more from Elizabeth Warren's exchange with you earlier this week. Take a listen.
For example, like building roads and bridges and childcare and so on. So I just want to be clear about this. Does that mean that the CEO of Hershey's, when the Hershey's executive goes on the earnings call, that he was lying when he said that actually they were able, I think, to more than offset inflation and higher manufacturing and overhead costs? In other words, it's what I call price gouging. They didn't just pass along costs. They larded a whole lot more on top of that, and that's why Hershey's was producing great for its investors. Was he lying? Should he have just said, look, I'm just passing along what that Democratic Congress and that Democratic president did?
Senator, the comments you're referring to are not simply passing along current cost increases, but also passing along previous cost increases.
No, that is not what he says. He says that our pricing more than offset inflation and higher manufacturing and overhead costs. And I'm asking you, was he lying?
Again, Senator, this is not just price increases that are happening today, but that happened yesterday as well. This is why, if you look at figure 14 in my written testimony, you can clearly see that the prices paid by businesses like Hershey's spike before the prices paid by consumers.
He clearly states he is not passing along costs.
I'm struggling to follow her argument. Is her argument that Hershey should not focus on turning a profit at all? Is that what she's saying?
Well, exactly, because again, chocolate at the end of the day, Vince, is for the children, right? This business is not about earning a profit. This is about providing candy for kids at the end of the day. I mean, who could be against that? The point that
but if a CEO, but if a CEO says in an earnings call that, yeah, we were able to cover the increased costs of inflation, and yes, we were still able to earn a profit, isn't that what you're supposed to do as a company? She made it seem like it was some great sin that he said that.
No, you're absolutely right. But what was essentially happening there was the fact that Hershey's, although they were not able initially to keep up their prices with their own rising costs, they eventually were. And finally, they were able to not only make up for current price increases, but the price increases that had happened from months or even years ago. And that's why you saw prices go up for businesses much sooner than you did for consumers. In fact, it has only been just within the last couple of months that prices paid by consumers have finally caught up to prices paid by businesses.
Yeah,
and these aren't like my numbers, my calculations. These are numbers from the Biden administration.
Right. And so there's been this false claim out there supported by, of course, the Democrats in Congress and certainly their media water carriers that everything we're seeing is the product of greedy corporations. They just decided all together collectively they're going to spike prices on everything to make our lives miserable and wring every last dollar out of us. And that's not, in fact, the case at all. They are quite literally covering their costs. And for that matter, throughout much of this, you and I have talked about this before, many of these companies have actually tried to insulate consumers from the price increases.
That's exactly right. And, if they don't do that, then they have to risk losing market share. And in much of the food industry, you're talking about pretty thin margins. And so as you start to lose market share, that can have a pretty devastating effect on your profitability. In other words, losing, let's say, 5 or 10% of market share may cause much more than a 5 or 10% hit to your bottom line. And so everyone has been pretty reluctant to increase prices. One of the figures that I pointed out was the fact that within the food industry, profits today are actually lower after you adjust for inflation than they were right before Biden took office. So this whole idea that somehow the food industry is gouging consumers, please explain to me then why they're making less money in real terms. And what's interesting, Vince, is the fact that how much more they are making that percentage increase in nominal terms almost exactly matches how much the average American worker is making today versus January of 2021. In other words, it's like a 14% increase, except both have fallen in inflation adjusted terms by about 4 or 5%. In other words, everyone is in the same boat. We are all poorer, consumers and businesses alike, because of the hidden tax of inflation. All of our incomes are going up by roughly the same amount, but what they can buy are all going down by roughly the same amount.
Yeah, well, so simple. Even Elizabeth Warren can understand it. EJ Antoni, thank you, sir, always for your commentary, your thoughts, your expertise, and have a happy Memorial Day weekend. Thank you, sir.